I don't tell jokes. I tell anecdotes and lies, but I don't tell them. Anyway, this is a joke. And it's not a joke, it's a story. It's a true story. It really happened.
He told jokes on his 100th birthday. He smoked 15 cigars a day for most of a century, and somehow lived to be older than the state of Oklahoma had existed when he was born. He buried a wife he adored, reinvented himself after her death, when everyone assumed he was finished, and then, at 80 years old, walked onto an Oscar stage and beat men 40 years younger than him. George Burns didn't just have a long career. He had 4 or 5 careers stacked on top of each other, each one starting right when the last one should have killed him professionally. And when he finally died 2 months after turning 100, he left behind a fortune that didn't go where most people assume it went. The real story of what happened to George Burns's money and why says more about who he actually was than almost anything he ever said on stage. Long before he was George Burns, he was Nathan Birnbaum, the 9th of 12 children crammed into a handful of rooms on New York's Lower East Side. His parents had come from Eastern Europe with nothing but the will to survive, and survival in that apartment meant warmth from bodies, not blankets, and dinner that was sometimes just potatoes and onions stretched across too many plates. His father worked as a caner weaving chair seats for pennies, and it was never enough. When Nathan was 7, his father died suddenly, and any illusion of stability went with him. School ended after the 5th grade. There was no time for it anymore. Nathan went out onto the street corners and shined shoes for a nickel a pair, hour after hour, his hands stained and his knees aching on the pavement. He sang for spare change with a ragtag group of neighborhood kids who called themselves a quartet more out of hope than ability. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even close to show business as anyone would recognize it. It was survival with a tune attached. But something in him held on to the idea that performing was different from suffering, that the two could exist in the same body without canceling each other out. He watched vaudeville comedians from the cheap seats and studied the way they controlled a room, the way a pause could be funnier than a punchline. That instinct, formed in poverty, never left him. Decades later, sitting across from interviewers who wanted to know his secret, he'd shrug and say something like, "You can't teach timing. You can only survive into it." Before he was George Burns, he tried on a dozen identities like coats that didn't quite fit. He performed under names invented purely to dodge booking agents who'd already turned him down once, a trick of the trade for young vaudevillians who needed to look like new blood. He borrowed his stage surname from a coal company, partly as a joke and partly out of gratitude, since as a kid he'd occasionally taken coal from their yard to keep his family from freezing. He sang on ferries. He performed in saloons that didn't care whether the entertainment was good, only whether it was cheap. He danced badly, sang worse, and got booed off more stages than most performers face in an entire career. At 14, he left home to chase the business seriously, and what followed was a decade of near misses, canceled acts, and partners who abandoned him mid-tour for better opportunities, or in one case, for a sailor she eloped with overnight. He was rejected by the Navy during World War I for being too short. Some people would have taken that as an excuse to sit the war out comfortably. Instead, by several accounts, he found unconventional ways to keep performing for servicemen, refusing to let a technicality end his ambitions. That refusal to accept no as a final answer would define almost every decade of his life that followed. By the time he was in his 20s, George Burns had failed at nearly everything he'd tried in show business. He'd been part of failed duos, failed trios, and failed solo acts. He'd worked as a soda jerk on a boardwalk, cracking jokes at customers who mostly just wanted their ice cream. What he didn't know yet was that all of it, the years of bombing, the years of scraping by, were building the one skill that would make him rich in instinct for exactly how long to wait before delivering a line. In 1923, in a booking office in Chicago, George Burns met a young Irish-American performer named Gracie Allen. He wasn't looking for a life partner. He was looking for someone to fill a hole in his act after his previous partner walked out on him mid-rehearsal. Gracie, whose own family act had recently fallen apart, needed work too. It was, on paper, a practical arrangement between two out-of-work vaudevillians. The plan was simple. George would be the comedian, and Gracie would play it straight, feeding him lines. That plan lasted almost exactly one performance. The moment they stepped in front of a live audience, something unexpected happened. The crowd wasn't laughing at George's jokes. They were laughing at Gracie, at her breathless, illogical, dizzyingly confident nonsense answers to perfectly ordinary questions. Her comic instincts were so sharp, so specific, that George realized within days that he'd built the act backwards. So he tore it down and rebuilt it. He became the patient straight man, the one asking sensible questions and reacting with a raised eyebrow, while Gracie's answers spiraled into gorgeous, confident absurdity. It was a genuinely unusual move for a male performer in that era, to hand the comedic spotlight to his female partner and step back into a supporting role. And it's part of why their act stood out from dozens of similar duos touring the same circuits. George later said, in essence, that there was something happening between Gracie and an audience that he simply couldn't compete with, so he stopped trying and let it work. Their professional partnership deepened into a personal one. After a period of Burns worrying that another suitor might take Gracie away from him for good, he pushed the issue, and the two married in January 1926 in Cleveland. It was the beginning of a partnership, professional and personal, that would run for nearly 4 decades and become one of the most recognizable pairings in the history of American entertainment. Success didn't arrive overnight. Burns and Allen spent years grinding through the vaudeville circuit, playing rough houses in front of unpredictable crowds, earning modest wages, and slowly refining an act that depended entirely on chemistry rather than elaborate staging. Their material was built around Gracie's character, a woman whose logic followed its own internal rules so confidently that arguing with her felt pointless, even when you knew she was wrong. By the mid-1920s, they'd worked their way onto bigger circuits and started earning real, if still modest, money. Then came the milestone. Every vaudeville act dreamed about a headlining engagement at New York's Palace Theater, widely considered the pinnacle achievement of the vaudeville era. Reaching the Palace meant you had, in the eyes of the entire industry, made it. Critics began comparing them to the biggest comedy names of the era. The years of struggling suddenly looked, from the outside, like a fast rise. From the inside, George and Gracie knew better. They'd earned every inch of that stage through nearly a decade of failure, reinvention, and refusal to quit. What came next surprised even them. In the late 1920s, they toured overseas for an extended radio engagement, introducing their act to audiences who had never heard of either of them. It worked. Audiences abroad responded to Gracie's logic-defying charm just as enthusiastically as American crowds had, proving the act wasn't a fluke of culture or geography. It was simply deeply funny, in a way that traveled. One of the most quietly remarkable parts of George Burns's story has nothing to do with punchlines. In the years surrounding the 1929 stock market crash, while much of the country and much of the entertainment industry specifically was losing everything, Burns began carefully investing the couple's vaudeville earnings into real estate. Property values had collapsed, and while panic drove most people away from buying anything, Burns saw opportunity in the wreckage. It was an unusually disciplined move for a young performer whose income was inherently unstable. Show business paychecks could vanish overnight if a theater closed or an act fell out of favor, and many of Burns and Allen's contemporaries spent their touring money as fast as they earned it, assuming the good times would simply continue. Burns didn't make that assumption. When the Depression deepened and theaters across the country began shuttering, throwing countless performers out of work with no savings to fall back on, Burns and Allen were insulated in a way that most of their peers simply weren't. This instinct plan for the version of the future where things go wrong, not just the version where they go right, would resurface again and again throughout his life, and it's part of the reason his estate, decades later, ended up being worth vastly more than a typical entertainer's. Burns and Allen's radio show launched in 1932, and it quickly became one of the most listened-to programs in the country. At its peak, tens of millions of Americans tuned in weekly, an almost incomprehensible share of the national audience at a time when radio was still relatively young. The show worked because it felt spontaneous and warm, rather than tightly scripted, even though George was in fact writing nearly every line himself. He made a deliberate choice, unusual for the era, to let the public believe Gracie was the true creative genius behind their act. In an industry where men routinely claim credit for women's work, Burns did the opposite, quietly building Gracie's reputation as the show's real star while writing in the background. Their material blurred fiction and real life in ways that felt ahead of their time. When Gracie needed an emergency surgery in the late 1930s, the show incorporated her real recovery into its storylines. When a Beverly Hills home caught fire after an accident with a cigar, they turned the frightening incident into a self-deprecating episode, rather than hiding it. Audiences responded to that honesty. It made the couple feel like people you actually knew, not distant celebrities performing at you. Gracie also ran one of the most memorable bits in American comedy history, a mock presidential campaign in the 1930s, complete with a fictional platform, campaign stops across dozens of states, and printed ballots. It was pure satire, but it landed so convincingly that when a real presidential election rolled around years later, a handful of voters genuinely wrote her name in, confusing local election officials who had to explain that, no, this was a bit from a radio show, not an actual candidate. In the mid-1930s, George and Gracie adopted 2 children, a daughter, Sandra, and a son, Ronnie, born 11 weeks apart in age and adopted roughly a year apart from each other. According to family accounts, Gracie was drawn to Ronnie specifically because he had been one of the more medically fragile infants available for adoption, and she felt strongly about giving him a stable home. Both children would occasionally appear on their parents' later television show, playing versions of themselves in a handful of episodes, though neither pursued show business as a lifelong career in the way their parents had. Behind the scenes, Gracie was fighting a health battle the public didn't know about for years. She had a heart condition that had likely been present since childhood, but it went undiagnosed and unaddressed for decades while she continued performing at a grueling pace, touring, filming, doing live radio, raising 2 children, all while her heart was quietly working against her. She pushed through fainting spells, migraines, and exhaustion for years, and by the late 1950s the toll had become undeniable. She retired from performing in 1958. 6 years later, in August 1964, she died of a heart attack at 58 years old. George Burns later said he had only cried twice in his life, once for his mother and once for Gracie. For roughly 2 years after her death, he reportedly kept an empty chair on stage during some of his solo performances, occasionally turning to address it as though she were simply standing just out of view. It's the kind of detail that sounds like Hollywood invention, but it's consistently repeated across biographical accounts of his post-Gracie years, and it captures something real about how disoriented he was without her. By any reasonable expectation, George Burns's career should have quietly ended sometime in the late 1960s. He was in his 70s. His partner and creative anchor of nearly 40 years was gone. A solo television show he attempted without Gracie failed to connect with audiences and was canceled after a single season. He was drinking heavily and smoking constantly, and at one point collapsed on stage from sheer exhaustion during a Las Vegas engagement. Doctors reportedly warned him bluntly that he wouldn't survive much longer if he didn't make serious changes. He quit drinking and quit relying on the crutches that had been propping him up. It wasn't a dramatic public reinvention. It was a quiet, private decision to simply stop killing himself slowly, and rather than fading out, he spent the following years rebuilding his career from something close to scratch, touring nightclubs, performing with a rotating cast of guest partners, and gradually finding his footing again as a solo entertainer in his own right, separate from the identity he'd shared with Gracie for 4 decades. Then, in his late 70s, everything changed again. He was cast in The Sunshine Boys, playing a role that had originally been intended for his old friend Jack Benny, before Benny's declining health made the part impossible for him to take. Burns stepped in, and the film became a genuine critical success. At the 1976 Academy Awards at 80 years old, George Burns won Best Supporting Actor, beating out a field that included younger than rising stars. It's still one of the most remarkable late-career comebacks in Hollywood history, Not a nostalgic honorary award, but a competitive earned win against actors who were, in some cases, younger than his own children. He followed that win with, "Oh God," opposite John Denver, a box office hit that reintroduced him to an entirely new younger generation of audiences who had no memory of Burns and Allen's radio heyday. He reportedly negotiated a contract clause allowing him to smoke his trademark cigars on set, refusing to let a movie role change the version of himself audiences had come to expect. Most performers slow down in their 80s. George Burns signed a contract in his late 80s, promising to perform a special show on his 100th birthday, a pledge that, at the time, sounded more like a joke than a serious commitment, the kind of thing entertainers say for a laugh, not something anyone expects to actually happen. He kept performing sold-out shows well into his 90s. He underwent major heart surgery at 88 and was reportedly back working, sometimes from a wheelchair off-camera, within months. In his early 90s, he received one of the entertainment industry's highest honors, performing a duet with a much younger star at a major honors ceremony, and later released an album, blending his own voice with archival recordings of Gracie, allowing fans to hear the two of them together one final time on record. It sold well and won industry recognition, a strange and moving coda to a partnership that had technically ended decades earlier. A serious fall in his late 90s finally slowed him down for good, causing a head injury, serious enough to require emergency surgery and forcing him to cancel the long-promised 100th birthday show he'd spent years building toward. His performing career, which had technically run for close to 9 decades by that point, effectively ended there. But even confined largely to his home in his final months, friends and visitors described him as still cracking jokes, still dictating new material, still fundamentally himself. He reached his 100th birthday in January 1996. Because his health no longer allowed for the large public celebration he'd planned for decades, he held a small private gathering instead, reportedly telling guests he'd see them at 101. He died less than 2 months later on March 9, 1996, of cardiac arrest at his home in Beverly Hills. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, and where a lot of the sensational retellings online get sloppy. George Burns died with an estate reportedly worth somewhere in the range of $30 million or more, built not just from decades of performing, but from those early, disciplined real estate investments he'd made back in the 1920s and continued making throughout his life. Some accounts of his estate's total value run considerably higher once royalties, real estate holdings, and residual income from his decades of film and television work are factored in. A significant portion of his estate was directed toward charitable causes, including institutions like Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and organizations connected to the entertainment industry's own welfare funds, causes tied closely to the world he'd spent his entire life in, and to Gracie's memory specifically, through a foundation established in her name that has continued distributing grants to arts and film-related organizations for decades since. Hundreds of personal items from his estate, from scripts to his famous cigars, were eventually auctioned off, offering fans and collectors a chance to own a small physical piece of his career.